You are listening to Australia's premier podcast dedicated to the world of wine, the Vincast. I'm so thrilled to be able to finally announce that I finally have a name for my wine that I made this year. The brand is Intrepido, and the Heathcote Sangiovese is called Blood of My Blood, which was a very much a collaborative effort. But the label has been designed by Brad Lucas, a really beautiful label. I'm so thrilled with it. If you haven't seen it already on my social media, check them out on Instagram and Twitter at Intrepid Wino. Brad actually designed the logos for the Vincast and for Intrepid Wino, so if you have seen those, then you'd be familiar with his work. But I also would highly recommend checking out Brad's business in Brunswick here in Melbourne. It is called Cult of the Vine, and it is absolutely Melbourne's best wine store and bar dedicated to natural wines. Has an amazing range of products from Australia and overseas. And I really, really highly recommend going and introducing yourself to Brad. Let him know that you heard about his shop on the podcast, and buy something from him because he has some beautiful stuff. But thanks very much, guys, as always, for your support, and I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Episode 111 of the Vincast, I chat with Campbell Mattinson, founder of The Wine Front and author of The Wine Hunter. Hello there, Vincasters. Welcome to another episode of the Vincast Wine Podcast. My name is James Gasbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and as always, it is a pleasure to have you joining me this week. I hope you've been following some of the videos that I've been sharing on the Intrepid Wino YouTube channel about some of my experiences at the Australian Alternative Varieties Wine Show this year. It really was a fantastic experience, and hopefully you'll get some insight into how important this wine show is, particularly for the emerging grape varieties being planted and worked with around Australia. And I hope you also have enjoyed some of the videos I've posted about my winemaking experience. As I mentioned in the intro, it finally has a name, so please do follow me so you can find out when I do actually release it and how you might want to buy it and taste it. But thank you very much, as always, for your support. I've been sitting on this week's episode for about a month, actually. Campbell Mattinson, my guest, was down in the Mornington Peninsula. He popped in on his way back to country Victoria, and we had a really good chat about his background. I have followed him for quite a while. He is one of Australia's authorities on wine, and it was an honour to have him on. So please, I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Stick around to the end so you can find out how to get in touch with both Campbell and myself. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Campbell, thank you very much for joining me here in the Vincast recording studio, which is basically my office at home, and welcome. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you, James.
You may or may not know, I tend to start every episode by asking my guest if they can remember if there was a certain incident that kind of made them think about wine in a different way, or was it a gradual sort of osmosis towards an interest in wine that ended up in a career in wine?
Boy, how long have you got?
We've got plenty of time.
It's a funny thing, you know. I always answer this question in the same way, but the answer I usually give is not the full story. So maybe we can just expand on that a little bit.
Sure.
You know, I think if I can be categorized as a wine person, I'm at my best communicating about wine when I've got an emotional connection. It's not just that I thought that wine was good.
Yeah.
I feel something towards it.
Yeah.
You know, and I guess, you know, all of my best writing, like I always say, whether it's about wine or anything else, if I'm not crying by the end of the page, I haven't written it very well. Like, you know, when
you want to listen,
I don't necessarily, the reader doesn't necessarily cry, but me, I get very emotional when I'm actually doing the writing.
Yeah.
my connection with wine is always going to come from an emotional place.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was a kid, we had my grandparents had a country property that was kind of part of the Yarra Valley. It's kind of in the King Lake area. And that property was just super important to me. And my grandfather was really influential upon me. And he was somebody in the 50s or 60s, moved to a country property to be self-sufficient, and grew all his own food.
Do you mean like the good lifestyle?
Look, he wasn't a hippie in any way. He was
No.
just an intellectual. It was like, I can teach myself to do this. I can grow large amounts of vegetables for myself. I can raise a small herd of cattle for meat. I can trap.
That's pretty.
Yeah, absolutely. He did that. He
very
trapped
ambitious.
rabbits.
Wow. What was his profession before that?
He was a shopkeeper in
okay.
Melbourne. He was back in the day.
Yeah.
Before supermarkets, he was the corner store.
Oh, the good old days.
And what he couldn't make himself, he would trade for.
A barter system.
Yeah, basically.
Wow,
So
okay.
he would trade. He grew potatoes and sold them for eggs and things like that.
Okay.
And so when I was about 13 or 14, he got too old for that, or thought he got too old for that, and sold the property. And I have spent the last 30 years traveling to that property and looking over the fence.
Thinking what
I really miss that property, that connection to that land in a way that is really kind of profound. And I still smell that place. I feel that place. That place is just still really important, even though our family has had nothing to do with that property for over 30 years.
Yeah.
35 years.
Is it a property that would make good, as the Italians call an azienda agricola? Like, could you actually plant a vineyard there? Would it be potentially a good spot for wine, do you think?
I've thought of that many times. And I think the climate would be fantastic. Whether or not it's kind of on the cold side of the mountain. It might be, or maybe it'd be great now.
Yeah, climate change
a lot of the
and
time,
all that sort of thing, for those who believe in it.
Yeah. Anyway, and so that's the long introduction to. There was a wine that I tasted in the mid 1990s at a work event of all things that I didn't know what it was. I was a wine drinker, but I wasn't a wine enthusiast. I was a very casual wine drinker, and this wine that was in its own way served blind because it was just poured at the table.
Yeah,
I just couldn't believe it. It's like
you found out what it was.
I did. I then sought out what it was. And it was, funnily enough, it was a Yarra Valley wine. It was a Coldstream Hills wine. It was a wine called Brierston, which was a Cab Merlot they used to make and stopped making at the end of the 90s. Back shortly after my moment, they stopped making it.
What was it, like a single vineyard or a single plot or something like that?
Brierston was a vineyard.
Okay.
I think it might have even been one of the original vineyards. And, the rise of Pinot meant that there were better uses of that vineyard,
Yeah.
But in fact, that said, maybe I'm wrong, I mean, they still do a Reserve Merlot and a Reserve Cabernet. So maybe those, where they come from, I'm not sure.
I love Yarra Cabernet.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing, I think until that moment, all of even though I was a wine drinker, all of the wines that I would drink would be sweet fruited.
Yeah, okay.
And here was a Yarra Valley wine that was Cabernet Merlot based. It was a bit herbal. And in some ways, it obviously didn't, but in some ways it kind of, in a way, perhaps evoked that childhood. It was from the same kind of area.
Yeah.
It smelt of the country. It didn't just smell of sweetness.
Right. Okay. So, what were you doing professionally at that time? Like, what was your sort of early career or your pre-wine career?
I started as a cadet journalist when I was 18, 19, and I've pretty much worked in every kind of writing since.
Wow.
So I was working in corporate publications at the time.
Okay. Just fill me in. What's a cadet journalist? Is that like
showing my age.
Is that more like a sort of a trade job, or like where you learn on the job sort of thing, or did you study journalism?
No, I didn't, and Cadetships still exist, but the normal pathway is you do journalism degree,
Sure.
and then I'm not sure. Well,
Like a graduate position type of thing.
there used to be once upon a time that was the way you became a journalist. You did a cadetship,
Right.
and then university qualifications came in. So there was always those two ways to do it. You could either go straight into as a first year cadet or do a university degree and come in as a fourth year cadet.
Okay.
And then I'm not exactly sure what happens now. But
Okay.
anyway, I went in as a first year cadet.
I think what happens now is that people tend not to study journalism because it's a slightly dwindling industry.
It's quite possible that you do a full degree and then still go in as a first year cadet.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, I went in as a first year cadet.
Okay. So you had lots of different experiences in journalism and writing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in journalism, I worked for suburban and country newspapers mostly.
Yep.
And then I did what everyone does. I tried PR. I did technical writing. I then went and did a university course where I was doing, film writing, short story writing, all that sort of stuff.
Wow.
So, there's a missing period of my career where I was going to be the novelist and
The great Australian.
yeah, which in many ways looks wasted, those years, and it's a lot of years to be honest, because there's not the novel, but I'm an immeasurably better writer for having tried.
What were there any particular parts of journalism that you found more fulfilling than others?
Well, again, it was the same as what I am with wine. I needed to feel an emotional connection, and so look, I did a lot of sports, which is all okay by me because I love sport. But it kind of seems like a funny thing to jump from sport to wine.
Yeah, I don't know. I think
Although with the obsession with point scoring of wines, maybe there's a scoreboard.
no, wine can be very competitive with all the wine shows
Yeah.
and gold medals, silver medals, bronze medals, that kind of thing, trophies. I think to a certain extent, not necessarily in the same way or for the same kind of market of people, but wine is a very egalitarian thing. It's a very democratic thing in the same way that sport can be, and it's enjoyed by a lot of people. But I think for true connoisseurs of sport or wine, you can interpret meaning into something. You can find like you prefer to. You find an emotional connection. Something gives you a more visceral reaction. In the same way that I got extremely emotional watching my Western Bulldogs finally win a grand final,
That's
since
right.
1954. A lot of people might, open a really old bottle of Australian or European wine and have a similar kind of euphoric experience. I think that, like there's something more to be read into sport than the simple act of two individuals or two teams playing against each other.
Yeah, true, absolutely, and I think that's where sport gets interesting is when you have an emotional connection. But there's so many emotional stories. I mean, the Olympics is always seems like such a kind of sold out entity that we're all kind of bored of, and then it happens, and there's all these incredible emotional stories that come out of it.
I think both of them also, there's an enormous amount of bullshit said about them.
That's
You
right.
just got to filter out the bullshit as much as possible.
True, though. Funnily enough, this was actually in the lost creative writing years. I won a sports writing award, which everyone thinks not. I always try to dispel the myth, but everyone thinks that because I won a sports writing award, and it was probably the sports writing award in Australia at the time, that I was this sports writer, which I did do a lot of suburban stuff, but never the big time. That sports writing award was for a piece of fiction. Right. It was a fictional sports story.
Sure.
And I can remember when I at the event where that was announced, somebody saying, you must be all over, just because of the style of this piece, you must be all over Best American Sports Writing, which is an anthology that comes out every year and is brilliant. And I'd never heard of it. Mm-hmm. And then I became obsessed with it for 10 years.
Okay.
And that is just that is, well, I've gone off it a little bit in recent times, but that is just an incredible example of what non-fiction writing can be.
Right.
And it was that book that inspired me to, when I had that moment with wine, I then went, why isn't anybody doing this with wine? What? There's landscape, there's people, there's struggle, there's all these, climactic events. It's like, this is just great fodder.
Mm.
Why isn't anybody doing like best American sports writing on wine?
In the same way that, there are so many amazing personalities in sport, there are so many amazing personalities in wine in all aspects of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like with sport, there's a lot of bullshit.
Yeah, very true. A lot of marketing, PR type stuff. So when this was going on, as far as the award and getting a bit more attention for sports writing, were you a fairly full-fledged wine lover at this stage?
That was around about the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And the third element of falling in love with wine is I was probably engaged to be married, and I always think that's it's a nesting time, and I think that cellaring wine and there's something about wine that is a nesting activity.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a social activity, but it's such a couple activity.
Sure, exactly.
In many times that's what it's when it's at its best.
Absolutely.
Sharing a wine with somebody, and also as you say, touring is such a couple activity. I was just down in Mornington, and went to a few restaurants, and it's just all the people rocking up are couples.
I know that, I was lucky enough to spend a number of years working for Domaine Chandon, and they had a lot of people coming through the cellar door, and most of the tables were set up for 2 to 4. So it was either couples or 2 couples, out for the day, having a lovely time, that kind of thing. There is a kind of lovely sort of romantic thing about
there is
wine visiting.
Yeah.
Were you doing much reading about wine at this point? Because
yes and no.
You talked about you thought there was something missing as far as wine writing at the time, that there wasn't enough story, enough emotion, enough kind of evocative writing about wine.
Yeah, look, I absolutely thought that this was territory that was largely unexplored, or the landscape wasn't ploughed. But that said, it's probably a bit unfair. I mean, did I know everything that was being written? No. And there are some terrific writers out there.
Absolutely.
But that said, the natural progression for your average person who goes crazy over wine is to go straight to the guidebooks.
Sure.
And I used to look at them and go, I actually want to sit down with a book and spend the weekend with it. You can't do that with these.
Yeah, exactly.
And when I went through a few of the books where you could, I was like, well, I need more.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some books where I've thought, in concept, this is exactly what I'm after. And then when I've read it, I've gone, well, that just missed it by such a wide margin.
Sure.
And then there's been others where I've gone, yep, that's it. And I always remember, I think that everyone still, all these years later, talks about Kermit Lynch's adventures on the wine route. It's, which the irony is, this is not somebody who's really a writer or set out to be a writer. He's kind of become one in some ways. But that book is so influential because it's so, apart from the fact that it's just personal.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't say at the start, look, these are the producers that are the best producers in the world. These aren't the prestige producers. These are the producers that I respond to.
Yeah.
And that's why people love that book. There aren't many examples of that sort of book.
Yeah, absolutely. That was sort of, as far as an example of that was written years ago. Yeah, that Campbell Lynch was the first one that my mind went to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the one that the book that I kind of read in that vein that I really responded to was the one that Ben Canada wrote, called The Perfect Glass of Wine.
Yes.
And I got given that by my mum, I think, for my birthday or Christmas when I first started getting into wine. And I liked it. It was just his experience, and I kind of liked finding meaning in his stories and that kind of thing. And that certainly helped me want to connect with wine in a different way and certainly communicate about wine in a different way.
Yeah, look, and Ben is a genuinely talented, excellent writer. It's a pity we haven't seen more from him.
Yeah.
And not only that, he's got a particular take on wine that is not. It's not a replica of anybody else's.
No, there's a wit to
Oh,
his
absolutely.
writing.
And there's not too many people you can say that of, though. You know that they've got their own peculiar take, and Ben was one of those.
Yeah, I guess Ben for me is kind of was like the previous generation's example of that kind of writing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how did you first get started as far as writing about wine? Like when did you kind of dip the toe in the water, so to speak?
Yeah, very quickly, probably too quickly.
Right.
And that was probably a good and a bad thing. Ultimately, a good thing. Yeah, a good thing commercially, not necessarily a good thing for my development.
Thing. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, look, I look as a journalist, I was always going to be a freelancer. I am a terrible journalist if I'm not interested.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're on staff, you're going to have to do a lot of stuff you're not interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just actively poor at that sort of journalism. And so I was always going to go to freelance, and I was always the reason I was going to do that was so that I could follow my nose. What am I interested in? And so as soon as I got interested in wine, it's like, well, I have to write about it.
Right.
Really not knowing the landscape at all.
Okay.
And I can remember approaching certain wine magazine editors and saying, look, I'm not an expert, but I can write.
Yeah.
So, I can do personality, features on profiles on winemakers and stuff like that. If you want a vertical tasting, get someone else, get one of the established people to do that.
Yeah.
I'll do the stuff that needs to be written. And, the response was, look, you're either a wine expert or you're not.
Yeah. So you were more journalist than wine expert in that you said, I want to find what to write about rather than here's what I think should be written about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I hated right from the start this idea of public relations driven journalism, and which is rife in wine.
Yeah.
In terms of and not necessarily like there's the obvious ways, but even in other ways, it's our 50th birthday, we're holding a vertical tasting, come and write about it. That was their idea, it's their birthday. And there may well be a good story, but chances are the fact that it's their birthday is not a good story. That kind of led, I'd rather drive out into a region and find some interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm. So more of the gonzo journalism style of things.
Which was what, getting back to Best American Short Stories, which comes out of that new journalism, breakthrough that happened in the 60s in America. And I think Tom Wolfe actually said, and I've always been inspired by it, that when he first started getting into gonzo journalism or new journalism, that he couldn't believe looking at, we're talking the 60s.
Yeah.
He couldn't believe looking at California in the 60s that there was all this material and it was being left alone. It's like,
so like you mean like journalistic material?
Yeah, there's stuff going on in society that is just going to bring the page, is going to light the page up.
Yeah.
And we're still, but media is still just looking at the kind of, its normal avenues.
Yeah.
There's all this stuff going out in the streets.
And the audience is completely unaware of this,
Yeah, that's right.
Of this because no one's writing about it.
And I actually think, he probably was a little bit undisciplined in some ways with his writing. But when you look at the stuff that he's recording, you just go, this just was unseen.
Yeah.
And that I was very much kind of inspired by that whole genre.
Yeah. So, what was your medium? Where were you writing for?
I was lucky enough that I got plenty of work from the now defunct magazine Divine that Andrew Wood did, and which was ahead of its time. And
is that the one that Max Allen was in?
Max Allen was a contributor to that.
Yep. Okay.
Sally Gudgeon was, and
yes.
Scott Wosley was, and that was great in that you could pretty much write whatever you liked. But I used to come across a lot of stories or get invited to events or whatever, and I used to go, I could write a story on this, but there's nowhere for it to go.
Sure.
There's only so much space, or I know some other journalist is going there too,
Mm-hmm.
and so people always think that it was a really strategic move to start up my own. So quite early, well, it's not that early, but it's quite early in terms of me writing about wine. I actually started up my own newsletter or website, and I started it not because I thought I was the one. Because I needed an avenue where
You
I could
wanted an
just
outlet.
write the way I wanted to write about the things I wanted to write about.
And this is before blogs sort of took
Yeah,
a little
I've always
bit of
had an
prominence.
uncomfortable relationship with the word blog because we were pre-blogs.
Yeah. So you started a newsletter. How did you expect to have the audience find you? Was it like a Field of Dreams style thing? So if you write it, they will come, kind of thing. It's like people will find me.
Yeah, it was absolutely a Field of Dreams thing. And I was, again, it wasn't strategic, but from the start, it never crossed my mind that I would just do it for free. It was more or less charged from day one. It wasn't quite. The first time I put out a newsletter, I said, I'm going to do 3 free newsletters so that people can have a look.
Yep.
Pass it around as much as you like. There's no copyright on these.
Right.
Sort of not quite, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just share this. I mean, we're talking kind of how the web has gone. So these were PDF newsletters emailed.
Yep. Okay. Like a zine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I said, I'm doing 3 for free, and then it's subscription based from there. And
then you would expecting with word of mouth, people would forward, check out this thing, to have enough of an interest that people would go, okay, now I'm going to subscribe.
Yeah,
pretty much,
yeah.
and pay for it.
Yeah, and in hindsight, I go, that was just so audacious. I can't believe I was asking people to pay for my writing on wine back when I was at quite near the start.
Yeah,
but that said, from the first day, people subscribed.
Wow. I think, one of the things was we were fortunate as far as timing, because I can imagine a lot of people were a little bit tired of very well established, magazines and periodicals that were possibly a little bit on the dry side, and there hadn't been, as you say, that kind of birth of the blog and more of that social media avenue for people to talk about wine. So people possibly were like, this is something new. This is exciting. It's opinion based rather than, just fact based or someone regurgitating a press release. Someone is actually telling stories. Let's sign up for that.
Yeah. And yeah, no, it was a really interesting experience. I mean, I got some support from, I'm sure that there were other wine writers who just thought, who is this noob? But, I'm always indebted to, I think the first person who subscribed was Max Allen.
Right.
And Max gave me work as well. He passed some work to me, and he was editing something at the time. I can't remember what it was, and he commissioned stuff, and so I did get some support from people who I looked up to, and that was really important, because when I say people subscribing the first day, those first 5 years, like you get over the flush of, gee, somebody's paying me to write this newsletter. When you're 3 or 4 years in, and yes, you have built that number, but it's not an extravagant number. And there was never any free, because it was always behind a paywall, there was never that free traffic.
Yeah.
So I could never brag about numbers, because it was never about numbers. It was only paid people.
Yeah. And what was kind of the big catalyst, in the same way that you got the award for sports writing, sports journalism, what was the kind of the big thing that happened that put you onto a much bigger stage as far as a wine communicator?
Geez, am I on a big stage yet?
I would say so. I would say so.
One thing I will say about Winefront that was really good is because I used to email it out to people and then it went to being a website. But I used to email it to people. People would read it and email back.
Yes. Okay. So when you were getting that sort of feedback, that was probably
Absolutely.
a big...
And so if I was a little bit, too enthusiastic about a wine, people would go, tone that down. Or, I can remember, I had these newsletters which sometimes, I don't know, 20, 24 pages. Like there was a lot of writing in it and it was all me.
Just you. Okay.
And, I'd slaved away doing this and put my heart and soul into this newsletter, sent it out, and somebody, a few hours later went, that's just poor. That, and just outlined all the things that I'd done wrong. And I think that his assessment was brutal. I did have it out with him, but at the same time, that criticism is just, we all hate it. It's just so invaluable. I always carry that guy on my back.
But that's the thing, like in the same way that as a communicator doing what you do, you are entitled to your opinion. Like you're speaking from the heart and you're being positive about things that you think are great. People are entitled to be the same towards your content, in the same way that we might be critical of someone's wine, someone might be critical of our criticism.
Yeah, which it's absolutely fair enough. And, I at the time, I'd put out an edition of Winefront and get all this immediate feedback. I'd then write an article for, Gourmet Traveller Wine or something, hear nothing. And you never hear, it's one of the great flaws, you never hear anything back from those publications. So you never get that. And I always look at writers who have only written for those sorts of publications and go, how do you know if you're striking a chord or not? I was always super aware what people were interested in and whether I was getting the tone right.
Did you keep like any data about the people that were subscribing? Did you have that kind of information?
I'm not a data kind of guy.
No, okay. So you couldn't you weren't necessarily aware of the demographics or
anything no, though. I mean, I guess you have a sense with that, but
and it wasn't like a lot more people subscribe to this edition of it because I wrote about this kind of thing. So maybe if I focus more on that, I might.
Did you ever feel that? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, absolutely. Yeah. It's the good and the bad news. I think that commercially it was super, and the success. And we can now call Winefront successful.
After how many years?
Yeah, after 15 years. It's only in the last 5 years where we would start to say that.
That's like a proper wine business then.
Yeah, true.
You ain't no flash in the pan by any means.
But, the good news is I was really, on top of what people wanted to hear about. Sure. And so I followed that lead.
Great.
Okay, that's the good news. The bad news is because I jumped in to writing about wine and doing this newsletter so early in my journey, I feel like my journey has been driven by other people. And so I look at some people who have just freestyled and go, would I have ended up there, and they're really into X and I'm not. And I go, the funny thing is that looks like my sort of thing. It's just I haven't been allowed to go there.
Okay.
Because I always remember when I did that kind of film short story school course, Martin Flanagan, the Fairfax well-known writer, came and talked to us, and and he looked at us and was just a bunch of students, and he kind of pointed to each of us and said, I could write a terrific article on every one of you because everybody's got a good story. And it's like that, I kind of go, whether the wines are my sort of wines or not, I can find interesting stories. So if you tell me what you want to know, I can do a good story on it.
Okay. So you like sort of pinpointing the interesting, like finding a story, in the same, with a wine or what you find particularly interesting about it. And then you can kind of zoom in on it and then pull back and bring the audience, bring the reader along with you on that journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works at its best when, obviously, when I love the wine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all about, the two sides are, I love the personal journeys. Not all the personal journeys are that interesting. But, when the journey is interesting, that's when I'm really on. And when the wine in the glass is like I'm always about the wine in the glass at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And when you can bring the two together, then it's happening.
It's pretty awesome. How did Winefront evolve into what it has become now? Like you're going from just yourself to you having other people who contribute, from it being mailed out and being, it was still just article based. And obviously now, it's largely review based as well. How did that evolution take place?
Yeah, look, I think I'm a fairly practical person, even though I'm a dreamer. And so from day one, look, I think the promise at the start was something like, I'll do X number of stories per month.
Sure.
And there'll be some reviews.
Yep.
And from day one, those reviews had scores on them. And therefore, in many circles, I'm seen as, one of the great advocates of scores. And, and I've reviewed for Halliday, and that's all scores. And as I say, Winefront's been scores from day one. Funnily enough, I'm not really a score guy in my own way. I would never pick up a wine for my own consumption and think, what score would I give it? Never in a million years. I don't think of scores for myself, and often I'll get asked, what did you give X? And I couldn't. As soon as I put the score on it, I would never know. I would never remember. They're not important to me, but I do see their usefulness. And as I say, I'm 100% certain whether they say it explicitly or not that people want them. And so, Winefront wouldn't be here if I hadn't put scores on wines at the start. There's no question about that. And so I've just always been really practical about that. People want them, they're going to get them.
Yep.
So I treat them seriously. It's not like we're just,
You're not flippant.
We're not, not just handing them out.
Arbitrarily, this score's fine, whatever.
But yeah.
Read everything else. Don't worry about the score.
And I think, I because I'm often late in real life, I was often late with these newsletters. I can remember somebody emailing me and saying, look, your problem is you're too much of a perfectionist with the stories. Just send me the scores. I don't care. And I think that in some ways,
that's
I know it's
slightly
depressing,
heartbreaking.
I know, and I think that because of that sort of feedback, Winefront has become much more of a review and score entity than what it was.
Yep.
And I guess, a bit like what I was saying before, when I got around the 7 or 8 year mark, you've got to a certain level. Technology's changed a bit. I'm a bit tired. I did get to a point where I went, I don't know that I want to do this anymore. I don't know that it wasn't wine. I'm just not sure that I want this, carrying this burden of I must get the next newsletter out every month. And, we're human beings. Like you have your good eras and your bad eras. And I just got to the point where I was, waking up every day going, put it this way, if people hadn't paid an annual subscription, I would have closed.
Okay.
But I was like, I wasn't prepared to just dud people. So I had two choices. I was either going to pay people back their subscription, what they were owed, or I was going to keep going.
Okay.
And so I kept going.
Very
and
much
then
the definition of limbo state, isn't it?
And so that, I always see that was a really difficult period. And then, around that time or just after that time when I started to go, no, actually, I do like this. I do want to do this. Gary Walsh had started his own site, which was free. He was getting good numbers, but not making any money out of it. And I just went...
Sounds familiar.
And I said, come over, we'll share the subscriptions, and it's not a monkey on either of us back. If you want a week off, you have a week off.
Yeah. Okay. And you could effectively double, your ability to generate content.
Yeah, that's right. Brought his readership. He's Oh, and then obviously I'm not quite sure how long he's been there, but Mike Benny for, I don't know, maybe it's 4 or 5 years now. I'm not sure, but that was again, Gary emailed me one day and said, "This Mike guy's good. We should bring him in." And in all honesty, I'd hardly heard of him. And Gary went, "He's good. That was good enough for me." And as I say, he was thinking of doing his own newsletter or own website or whatever. And it's just it's heartbreaking trying to build up. I'd seen my journey of how hard it was to get real numbers. We can give him real numbers from day one, and we'll work out a model to make it worth his while.
Yeah, and in the same way, it's given you all the opportunity to, like knowing that, look, if I take a week off to do something, or if I take a couple of months off to do something, there's still going to be someone generating content, uploading reviews, that kind of thing, and that's given you the opportunity to write for other publications, and I think more importantly for writing books. And the one obviously that I've connected with this year was you very generously sent me a copy of The Wine Hunter, and I'm really interested to know, what was the journey writing about Maurice O'Shea?
Yeah, it's a funny one. It's as I say, I'd been for this long period where I was trying to be a novelist, and those ambitions are not completely lost. But and I went through a long period where I went, in the next 6 months I'm publishing this really good novel. Like that next 6 months never came, but and I finally got to a point in, I don't even know when it was, maybe 2005, where it just crossed my mind. I went, maybe that's not going to happen. Like all my adult life, or from 15 onwards, I just assumed this novel I was on the cusp of this really good novel. And so for the first time in 20 years or something, I went, what if it doesn't happen? And I got really despondent. And as life is, McWilliams came to me and said, "We need a story on Maurice O'Shea. We've seen some of the stuff you've done. We think you're the one to do it."
Yeah.
And so it wasn't actually my idea, but for someone to kind of give me a story that I could write creatively and give me a deadline and pay me to allocate some proper time, which is the big issue, And so I couldn't actually do it now in a way, but I was able to say, look, for the next 3 months, I'm not doing anything. I'm doing O'Shea. And it was really only that sort of time period that I had. But to get up every day for 3 months and not do anything else was, a sort of, that's how the book happened. And that's the sort of luxury that it's really hard to get that. Because if I'm going to write well, I need that. There's nothing else happening. And every day there's nothing else happening. And so, that's why that book's a bit of an island in my life.
We talked about, I think, at the beginning and the end of the book about, how incredible it was to just be 100% immersed in the story and trying to sort of think about what it would have been like for O'Shea, at this time, and the challenges he would have met. Did you spend a lot of time up in the Hunter Valley? Did you visit Mount Pleasant?
I did, and I tried to spend as much time as possible just sitting there, just out in the landscape.
Soaking it up.
Yeah, and did a fair amount of the writing, actually, just sitting up on the hill or sitting, in situ, just getting the feel for the place. That's it. As I say in the book, I was initially kind of, the idea was that I'd write a 15,000 word piece on him, a long essay.
Yeah.
And then I met his daughter. And that was just the most, I talk about emotion. That was we just sat there and cried all day, because it was she just poured it out and I soaked it up.
Yeah.
And I just walked away from that and went, oh no, we've got a book on our hands here.
Yeah.
And the whole project from that day onwards, which was kind of the turning point of my life in many ways, the whole project, the whole thing is completely different. Everything is different after that moment.
That was your sort of visceral reaction, and that was so kind of inspiration to really expand on that and really do justice to, the contribution he made to the Australian wine industry.
People had said to me, somebody needs to write a book on O'Shea, somebody needs to write a book on Colin Priest, and you should do them. Now, and there is an argument someone should do a book on Max Schubert, though one has been done, but that would be a great trilogy. But I haven't got to Colin Priest.
Okay.
But I haven't found an emotional way into Colin Priest, but with Maurice I did.
Yeah.
The great attraction with Colin is that other than, real wine nerds, no one's really heard of him.
Well, I think to a certain extent, like when I started working in wine, it was just a Liquorland store, and I remember there was a brand, Priest.
There was.
Priest Merlot was a big seller.
Yeah, and that...
But people wouldn't necessarily know that.
Is that brand still around?
I don't know. I
haven't seen it for a long time. No,
yeah.
But there's no real connection with the fact that was a person, and not only was it a person, but he made some of the most beautiful wines that have ever been made.
Yeah.
In Victorian terms, anyway.
It's funny when you think about like a lot of brands. People think of them as brands, but they actually were people.
Yeah.
And then the next evolution was for them to become brands. And now it's sort of Australian wine seems to be heading back towards more of that like connection with the winemaker, I guess. People are releasing, I guess maybe in not necessarily in a big brand retail sort of environment, but certainly, in the happening areas of wine consumption.
Yeah.
People are talking, the rock star winemaker is coming back,
which is a good and a bad thing. But certainly, if you're into certain, if you like what a winemaker does, then they will take it into everything they do.
Absolutely. So, and until recently, you were also contributing to Australian Wine Companion. Was that an interesting experience working with James? Challenging.
Yeah, look, it was. It was something when the opportunity was presented to me, I had to do, and I had no desire to do for much longer than I did.
Sure.
Look, I did it for 2.5 editions. I feel like I did a good job. Who knows? You don't get any feedback.
It's another one of those.
I certainly, that's not an emotional gig. That is just work. But I feel like I gave it everything I could. It consumes your life for 4 months of the year, and you take another couple of months to get over it. So it feels like it's 6 months. And, logistically, physically, mentally, how am I going to describe this Shiraz different to the other 500 in a short period of time, which is one of the challenges of the wine writer's life. But when there's a bit of, space between them, it's much easier. When you're doing 50 of them a day, every day for months, then that gets challenging.
I was going to say, I can't imagine the people are pouring through the wine companion going, hey, he made the same note about this Shiraz back on page 20.
Well, funnily enough, somebody did point one out to me recently and said, yes, the train spotters are amongst us. Somebody said, you've made the same metaphor in 2 wines. I said, no, really?
Of how many wines in that guide?
Yeah.
Goodness sake. I suppose if you got a digital edition, you could just, go keyword search.
Yeah, true.
Let's see how many times you use the word very. Or quite. So that must have been challenging to wade through the mountain of samples that you would have had to, I guess.
Look, the difference with that gig is that it's such a concentrated period, and whilst it is 3 months or so, 3 or 4 months, it comes as a deluge that, I felt like I lost my sense of naivety of how wine writing can work.
Yeah.
Because I'd gone from lots of samples every day, every week for, more than 10 years. And then you take on that gig and suddenly you start getting phenomenal loads of wine each day.
Pallet a week type of thing.
I don't know, a pallet a day.
Oh my God.
Like just, the doorbell just constantly goes with couriers. It's a freakish experience.
Yeah. And any sort of other interesting projects you got coming up you might want to talk about?
Oh, look, not really. Not in the wine sense. One of the reasons I resigned from the Halliday gig and from the Halliday magazine both times under the hope that if I free space, I will write more long form pieces, whether they're fiction or non-fiction. And so, for the first time since Wine Hunter, in a way, I am, spending days where I'm not just tasting, and I'm trying to allocate parts of the week where I don't taste and I actually write.
Yeah.
You can write thousands of words every day, but they're all just tasting notes. And whilst you're fulfilling your function, it's not satisfying.
Yeah.
You don't look back and go, "Gee, that was a fantastic note." Well, actually, you do, but not in general. You don't. Not. Whereas you look back and go, "Gee, that was a really good piece." Maybe I would have done X or Y different, but I am proud of that, and so. Yeah, I wouldn't like to say specifically what I'm working on, but hopefully there are some things coming that I'm proud of.
But in the same way that, you always want to have an emotional connection with something, I think it is hard for people to have an emotional connection to a tasting note unless, you come up with this amazing sort of turn of phrase.
Yeah.
And I think that it's probably pretty indicative that people will give you more feedback and tell you a reason why they've connected with an article because you're actually saying something more than here's how the wine is structured and this is what it reminds me of kind of thing. So I think that there is something a little bit more, at least creatively rewarding in writing something that is more than just a note.
Oh yeah, absolutely. From a commercial point of view, there's always been that thing with wine style that people talk dry, drink sweet, and with the equivalent in wine publishing is people talk stories by scores. And so everybody says they don't want scores, they don't want reviews, they want stories, but people don't buy them.
So the stories create the wine lover, but the scores, encourage them to buy wine, I guess.
Yeah, and if you looked at numbers of, funnily, exceptions to the rule are things like Adventures on the Wine Route, but I know what you think of the actual book. But if you looked at the year that Halliday produced Wine Companion, and he did a book called, I think, Wine Odyssey, which was like a diary of his year,
right?
Which, in concept at least, is a much more interesting thing. He says that's one of the few books that was almost pulped the day it came out. Like it just went absolutely nowhere, whereas the book goes to reprint.
I've said that book sounds awesome. Like just something like learning about the process that goes into something like the Wine Companion is fascinating.
Yeah, look, it's not unkind to say that I'm not sure that the execution was quite what it could have been with that book, but in concept, it was fantastic.
Campbell, it has been really fascinating finding out more about your journey and your experiences, and look, I look forward to reading. Hopefully, lots more books. Would you like to share with the audience, I'm sure many of them already know it, but the website address for the Wine Front and your social media accounts, if you'd like to share them?
Yeah, look, the website is winefront.com.au, and look, I'm into social media under my own name, but go to the website.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and looking forward to sharing a wine with you sometime soon.
Thanks for your time.
And as always, thank you very much, dear listeners, for joining us on this episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and I would really love for you to follow me on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Intrepid Wino, and on Twitter, the podcast is at the Vincast. Head to facebook.com/Intrepid Wino, hit that like button, follow my Facebook page, and check out some of the posts and links that I put there. And I'd love for you to follow me on YouTube. Head to the Intrepid Wino YouTube channel, see some of my Let's Taste videos, my Intrepid winemaking experiences, and also my recent series on the Alternative Varieties Wine Show. You can follow the podcast and download episodes via a number of different different podcast sharing apps and programs, iTunes, Stitcher, Player FM, Podbean. Subscribing means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available, and it's also a fantastic way to provide feedback to myself and also to former and future guests of the podcast by leaving a 5-star rating and a review. Of course, all of that information, as always, is available at intrepidwino.com. You can find ways of getting in contact with me there. I'd love to hear from you. Hit me up on email, thevincast@gmail.com. Got some really exciting guests coming up soon. But until next time, bye.